and I call us the men in black, you know, instead of the man in black.
Right.
The men in black, I think we were all just making a living.
When the news broke of Jimmy Caps's passing in 2020, fans mourned the quiet man who had shaped the very heartbeat of country music. He was the invisible hand behind timeless songs, the guitarist who could weave emotion into a single note, yet rarely stepped into the spotlight. But few knew that the biggest surprise of his life's work wasn't on stage. It was locked away behind the door of an old garage. After his death, the garage was opened. At first glance, it looked like any other storage space. Dusty shelves, battered boxes, instruments stacked against the wall. But as family and friends began to sift through its contents, they realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Hidden among the clutter were reels of unreleased recordings, instruments that had carried the soul of Nashville, and handwritten notes that exposed the private genius of a man who defined an era. This was not just a garage, it was a time capsule, a museum of secrets that even his closest collaborators had never seen. Today, we're stepping inside that sacred space to uncover what Jimmy Caps left behind and why it stunned the music world. Long before Nashville knew his name, Jimmy Caps was just a quiet boy in Fayetteville, North Carolina, growing up in a world where music was more comfort than career. His family wasn't wealthy, and opportunities were slim, but what he did have was curiosity. One day, tucked away in the corner of his home, he found a battered Stella guitar. Its strings were worn, its body scratched, but to young Jimmy, it was a treasure. The moment his fingers pressed against the frets, something clicked. That guitar became his teacher. He would spend hours mimicking the sounds he heard on local radio stations, trying to decode the mystery of chords and melodies. Unlike many kids his age, Jimmy wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing understanding. He wanted to know how notes could carry stories, how rhythm could echo emotion. By his teenage years, it was clear he had something rare: discipline. While others dabbled, Jimmy practiced relentlessly, breaking songs down into their smallest details. He wasn't just playing, he was studying. That dedication soon caught the attention of musicians in nearby towns, and invitations to small gigs started trickling in. What nobody realized then was that this quiet, humble boy would one day leave fingerprints on the very foundation of American country music. Jimmy wasn't born into the spotlight, but from the beginning, he was destined to shape it. When Jimmy Caps arrived in Nashville, he didn't burst onto the scene with flashy solos or bold showmanship. Instead, he slipped into studios with a calm confidence, earning trust one session at a time. To most, he was the man in the back, head down, guitar in hand, steady as stone. But to producers and artists, he was the secret weapon. It was Caps's touch you heard on George Jones's "He Stopped Loving Her Today," often called the greatest country ballad ever written. It was his guitar threading like a heartbeat through Kenny Rogers' "The Gambler." Time and again, his playing elevated songs from good to unforgettable, shaping the soundtrack of an era without demanding credit. What set him apart wasn't just skill, but anticipation. In chaotic studio sessions, he could sense what a song needed before anyone spoke it aloud. He memorized chord changes, noted subtle variations, and delivered perfection on the first take. Musicians leaned on him for timing. Producers leaned on him for vision. Audiences never saw him, yet his sound lived in their hearts. Jimmy Caps wasn't chasing stardom. He was building legacies, one note at a time. From the outside, Jimmy Caps's garage looked ordinary, just another modest structure tucked away in Nashville. The paint was weathered, the door creaked, and to anyone passing by, it seemed like nothing more than storage for tools and old furniture. But when the door swung open after his passing, the truth revealed itself. This wasn't storage. It was a shrine. Every corner of the garage told a story. The walls were lined with faded posters from concerts long past, their colors dulled by decades of sunlight. Black and white photographs showed smiling faces of legends: George Jones, Kenny Rogers, Merle Haggard, captured in candid moments away from the stage. Some pictures were taped carelessly, others framed with quiet pride, as though Caps had built a private museum only for himself. Shelves groaned under the weight of awards and plaques. Unlike many musicians, He never displayed them in flashy cases. Instead, they sat tucked between guitar cases and dusty amplifiers, half-hidden reminders of decades of mastery. And then there were the instruments, dozens of them, some polished, gleaming under a thin coat of dust, others worn from years of endless sessions. Each guitar carried its own voice, waiting silently for the man who once brought them to life. Stepping into that garage was like stepping into Caps's mind, disciplined, meticulous, but deeply human. It wasn't designed for applause, it was built for memory, for music. Among the first things people noticed in Jimmy Caps's garage were the guitars. They weren't simply instruments lined up for show. They were voices, each with its own personality. Some were battle-scarred veterans of the studio, their fretboards smoothed from decades of recording. Others looked almost untouched, waiting patiently for the right moment to sing. To Caps, a guitar was never just wood and strings. It was a storyteller. One instrument carried the mellow, honeyed tones perfect for a ballad, while another could slice through a crowded mix with sharp clarity. He knew exactly which one to reach for depending on the emotion a song demanded. Alongside the guitars sat vintage amplifiers, carefully labeled and maintained. They hummed with history, machines that had powered the sounds of countless hits. On a workbench, capos, picks, and worn straps hinted at the small tools of mastery, the everyday objects that allowed him to build timeless performances. Visitors later described the site as overwhelming, not because of quantity, but because of the sense of intimacy. Each guitar wasn't just an artifact, it was part of Jimmy himself, a silent partner in his craft. Together, they told the story of a man who spoke most loudly when he let the strings do the talking. Tucked away in boxes and crates, buried beneath layers of dust, lay reels of magnetic tape that no one outside Jimmy Caps had ever heard. These weren't rough demos or unfinished scraps. They were complete, carefully recorded tracks that showcased a side of Caps the world had never known. Some recordings were raw blues numbers, filled with grit and emotion, his guitar bending and crying as if channeling something primal. Others were soft, almost dreamlike instrumentals, the kind of pieces that seemed less like practice and more like private conversations with the soul. A few even hinted at experiments far beyond country, blending jazz phrasing and rock undertones in ways that felt startlingly ahead of their time. What stunned music historians was not just the diversity, but the care. Every reel was labeled with dates, keys, and handwritten notes. Some carried instructions like "play with sorrow" or "light touch," revealing that Caps wasn't merely recording sound, he was chasing feelings. His precision in the studio extended to this hidden archive, proving these pieces mattered deeply to him, even if he chose to keep them private. Among the discoveries were jam sessions with other Nashville greats. Informal gatherings, never meant for release, where legends played without pressure. These recordings captured the spark of creativity in its purest form, moments when music was about joy, not charts or sales. Listening back, musicians described the tapes as revelatory. For decades, audiences had known Caps as the man who supported others. These recordings showed him as the centerpiece, the storyteller, the visionary. In those hidden reels, Jimmy Caps stepped into the spotlight, not for fame, but for truth. Beyond the guitars and reels of tape, another treasure lay scattered across Jimmy Caps's workbench. Stacks of handwritten notes, scraps of paper, and chord charts etched in pencil. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like doodles, but to musicians, they were blueprints, maps of songs that would go on to define Nashville's golden era. Caps had a habit of writing down everything, small progressions scribbled in the margins, rhythmic patterns jotted in shorthand, even arrows pointing to how a melody should rise gently or hold back. These weren't idle reminders, they were glimpses into his process, the way he thought about music before it ever reached the studio floor. Some sheets carried annotations tied to specific emotions: lonely tension, soft resolve, hopeful release. Others detailed exact picking techniques or alternate tunings he wanted to experiment with. Taken together, the notes painted a portrait of an artist who never stopped studying, never stopped refining. Musicians who later examined these papers said it was like stepping inside the mind of a master craftsman, Each page revealed that what sounded effortless on record was actually the result of meticulous design. These blueprints proved that Jimmy Caps's genius wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, disciplined, and deeply human. Among the guitars, tapes, and notes, perhaps the most surprising discoveries in Jimmy Caps's garage weren't musical at all. They were personal. In drawers and boxes, carefully organized by year, lay letters, photographs, and keepsakes that revealed the man behind the music. Stacks of envelopes contained heartfelt letters from artists, producers, and even students he had mentored. Some were short thank yous for his patience during a recording session, while others ran pages long, describing how his quiet encouragement had changed the course of someone's career. These weren't fan letters. They were testaments to the respect and gratitude he quietly earned across decades. Photographs told their own story. Black and white snapshots of a young Caps laughing with friends backstage, or strumming in a dim studio between takes. Rare color prints captured him standing shoulder to shoulder with legends like George Jones and Kenny Rogers, not in staged publicity shots, but in private moments of friendship and trust. These images showed a man more comfortable in the background, yet always at the center of connection. Mixed in with the letters and photos were small personal items that carried immense meaning. A harmonica gifted by a close friend, a worn capo with initials scratched into the back, even a faded concert ticket from his youth. They were simple objects, yet each symbolized turning points and inspirations that shaped his journey. Together, these artifacts painted a portrait of Jimmy Caps, not just as a musician, but as a mentor, a friend, and a humble man who valued relationships as deeply as music. Among the guitars, tapes, and notes, perhaps the most surprising discoveries in Jimmy Caps's garage weren't musical at all. They were deeply personal. In neatly labeled boxes, tucked away with the same care he gave to his instruments, were letters, photographs, and keepsakes that revealed an intimate side of a man the public rarely saw. Dozens of envelopes held handwritten letters, some yellowed with age, others crisp and recent. These weren't fan mail. They were notes from fellow musicians, producers, and students whose lives Caps had touched. One letter came from a young guitarist who wrote that Jimmy's quiet advice had given him the courage to keep pursuing music when he was ready to quit. Another came from a well-known country star who thanked him for his patience during an early session, crediting Jimmy for making the recording a success. Reading them, it became clear that Caps's legacy wasn't only about what he played, it was about who he lifted up. The photographs were just as revealing. Black and white snapshots showed him as a young man, laughing with friends, guitar slung loosely over his shoulder. Color prints captured rare moments with legends like George Jones and Kenny Rogers, not posed for the spotlight, but in casual, human moments. Backstage jokes, quiet rehearsals, shared meals. These images spoke volumes about the trust and respect he inspired. And then there were the small treasures only he seemed to value. A harmonica gifted by a lifelong friend, a capo with initials carved into the back, and even a ticket stub from a concert that had inspired him as a boy. These objects may have looked ordinary, but together they traced the journey of a life lived in music, each one tied to a memory or turning point. What struck those who cataloged the garage was how deliberately he had preserved these mementos. Just as he curated his sound, he curated his story, quietly, privately, without the need for show. These artifacts prove that Jimmy Caps measured success not by awards or headlines, but by connection, mentorship, and integrity. When word spread about what Jimmy Caps's garage held, the reaction across Nashville was instant and overwhelming. Musicians who had worked alongside him spoke with awe, while younger players who had only known his name from liner notes were suddenly introduced to the full depth of his influence. The Musicians Hall of Fame quickly dispatched curators to examine the collection, calling it one of the most important private archives of country music ever uncovered. Radio stations devoted entire segments to replaying songs where his guitar had quietly carried the weight of emotion. Social media filled with tributes, as fans pieced together their favorite tracks and realized just how often Jimmy's hand had been guiding the sound. Even music schools took notice. Professors requested access to his handwritten notes and unreleased recordings, insisting they offered lessons that no textbook could replicate. For many, the discovery reframed Capps not simply as a session guitarist, but as a teacher, innovator, and cultural architect. The garage, once seen as an ordinary outbuilding, had become a beacon, a reminder that greatness doesn't always demand the spotlight. Sometimes it thrives in the quiet corners, waiting to be discovered. Even with the garage opened and its treasures revealed, there is still a sense that Jimmy Capps's story remains unfinished. The tapes, the notes, the photographs, they gave us rare glimpses into his genius. But they also raised questions. How many more recordings might be hidden away in attics, basements, or forgotten boxes? What private experiments or collaborations did he choose to keep for himself? That mystery is part of his legacy. Jimmy Capps was never one to chase the spotlight. His greatness lived in the quiet details, an exact chord change, a note played just soft enough to make a listener pause. And even now, long after his passing, his influence continues to echo across Nashville. From the young musicians who studied his charts, to the fans rediscovering songs they've loved for decades, his presence is everywhere. The garage proved that sometimes the most extraordinary legacies are the ones built out of sight, patiently waiting to be uncovered. Now we ask you, which discovery from Jimmy Capps's garage moved you the most? Was it the unreleased recordings, the intimate letters, or the instruments that shaped generations of music? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take.